Welcome to this lesson on faith and works in James 2:14 to 26. Let's begin just by reading the passage so it's fresh in our minds. I'll be reading from the NRSV. It says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill,' and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. You believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says, 'Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness,' and he was called the friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead." Let's start at the beginning and work our way through the text. According to the NRSV, James 2:14 reads, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you?" Now I have two issues with the translation of this last question. Can faith save you? First, faith in this question is not faith in general. He's not saying, does faith have the power to save? He's specifically referring to the faith without works that he just mentioned. Okay? It's can that kind of faith save you? The second issue I have is that in Greek, this question expects a negative answer. Can faith save you? Doesn't really. It's open-ended. You could answer it yes or no. But English does have ways of asking a question that expects a negative answer. So I would not phrase that question that way, but like this. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Such faith cannot save you, can it? And there we see that it expects the negative answer, no, it can't. Okay? So, James 2:14 to 17 should read like this. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Such faith cannot save you, can it? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith, by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Now it's worth noting here that he sets up an analogy. So having faith without works, he says, is the same thing as if you went to a brother or sister, saw that they were naked and hungry, and said to them, "Hey, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill," when they clearly had no way of doing it. It's empty words. At the same time, I think James has also chosen an example that illustrates what faith looks like when it doesn't have works to complement it. It's also worth noting that he specifies here particularly a brother or sister. So he's talking particularly about our family of faith. If we're not taking care of them, if we're not looking out for our brothers and sisters in particular, then what good is our faith? The what good is it that starts verse 14 is the same as the what is the good of that at the end of verse 16. Okay? He then goes on, "But someone will say, 'You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith.'" Now there's an issue of translation here as well, and the problem is that Greek doesn't have quotation marks. So we have to decide whether to use quotation marks here, and if so, how long to make the quote. The NRSV has chosen to enclose in quotation marks, "You have faith and I have works." Now let's think about how this construes the conversation and see if it works. We have two people here. We'll call this one someone and this one James. Okay? Now according to the way the NRSV has punctuated this, someone says, "Well, you have faith and I have works." Okay, so he's accusing James of having faith and claiming he himself has works. Now, according to this, James then responds, "Show me your faith apart from works, and I will show you my faith by my works." This doesn't really work. because here the someone has claimed that they have works while James has faith. And then to respond to that, James says, will you show me your faith apart from works? Well, all he's claimed about himself is that he has works. And then James says, I'll show you my faith by my works. But the guy's already postulated that James has faith. So it doesn't seem to line up. The accusations seem to be working at cross purposes. So I don't think that really works. The NASB offers a different way of punctuating it. They suggest that the whole thing is said by someone. So it looks like this. You have faith and I have works. So James has faith, someone has works, just like before. But now the second part is also still being spoken by this person. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Okay? Now here it actually lines up. James claims to have faith according to this person, and so he's saying, show me your faith without works. While he himself is saying, I'll show you my faith by my works, which I've claimed to have. So that works well. The problem here is that James is now being put as the person who claims to only have faith. Whereas the whole rest of the argument is James arguing that your faith has to be expressed in works. Otherwise, it's dead. So here, the logic kind of works, but in context, it doesn't seem to work either, because the person who's pushing back against James is essentially taking the position that James is advocating for in the rest of the piece and attributing the position that he's arguing against to James. So I don't think that really works either. So here's a third alternative. Maybe this is just indirect speech. It's kind of a summary, not actually quoting. So here it reads like this. But someone will say you have faith and I have works. Okay, so here, the someone or the you has faith, and James has works, which is what he's been advocating for. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Now here we have the same alignment that we saw before in the previous one. The person who supposedly has faith is being challenged to show it without their works, while James is claiming my works essentially illustrate my faith. Now the advantage of this position is that James is now advocating for the same position that he seems to be advocating for in the rest of the passage. So I think that's good. This one, it is a little awkward because you have someone will say you have faith. And so we kind of switch from third person to second person. It is a little awkward, but I think this is still the best way of reading the passage because it makes sense logically if the someone is either the you who has faith, and James just kind of switches to addressing directly, or someone is pointing out James's opponent saying you have faith, and then James switches back to himself saying I have works. I think this is the best way to read the passage. The interlocutor, the challenger, is being challenged to show his faith even though he doesn't have works, whereas James is saying my works show my faith. Now, a lot of commentators think that the issue here is therefore about proving that you have faith. I don't know that that's really the issue here. Because to whom do you have to prove it? I mean, why do you have to prove to James that you have faith? I think his point is that your faith is lacking. It's not a sufficient faith. It's not a living faith if you don't have works. And he's just kind of highlighting that point. He's not saying that you have to be able to prove you have faith to somebody, whoever that would be. So he says, someone will say you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. You believe that God is one. Now this is alluding to the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Okay, it's not a direct quote. He says God is one, but this was a fundamental tenet of Jewish belief. So he says, you believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. In other words, it's not enough to have the right doctrine. It's good to have the right doctrine. You do well if you have the right doctrine, but by itself, having the right doctrine doesn't really get you anything. Even demons have the right doctrine. They have a correct faith in the sense of doctrine. What he's saying here is that salvation isn't necessarily a matter just of passing your systematic theology exam. If that's all your faith is, just a series of beliefs that you can kick back and, oh yeah, I believe this, I believe this, I believe. Well, demons can do that too. That's no better than a demonic faith. He goes on. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, which is Genesis 15:6. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So here he appeals to Abraham. Abraham famously offers his son Isaac on the altar in Genesis 22. The curious thing is that James says this is the fulfillment of Genesis 15:6, when Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now what's going on in Genesis 15:6? Well, God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, haven't I been good to you? And Abraham's like, well, yeah, I guess. God's like, what's wrong? What's the problem? He says, okay, you've blessed me abundantly. I have all these possessions. I have no one to pass it on to. I have no children. My wife is barren. And so I'm going to have to pass all this wonderful stuff you've given me on to my maidservant son, Eliezer. Okay? So God says, no, come outside. And he basically promises him that one from his own body will be his heir. And then he says, look at the stars, so will your descendants be. And it says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay? Now, how is his offering of Isaac on the altar the fulfillment of this Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness? Well, if you remember Genesis 22, this account, it's called the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, that's the Hebrew word, binding. God comes to Abraham, and he tells him, look, I want you to go to the place where I will show you and offer up your son. Abraham says, okay. So they go, and eventually, after 3 days' travel, he sees the mountain, and he knows that's where God wants to take him. And so Genesis 22:5, then Abraham said to his young men who were traveling with them, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Now, this is kind of curious, because Abraham knows what God has called him to do, to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice on the mountain. And yet he says, we will come back to you. Now, it could be that he's just, lying or kind of hiding his intention. But I think he actually means it. We will come back to you. Why is it that Abraham is okay with offering up his own son? I think it's because he believes what God told him in Genesis 15. Remember what God told him? One from your own body will be your heir. And subsequently, it was revealed that Isaac was that heir. Isaac can't inherit if he's dead. So God has called for Abraham to offer up Isaac. He's going to do it, but he knows that Isaac has to come off that mountain. Because if not, then he can't inherit, and God's promise wouldn't be true. And sure enough, he goes up on the mountain and he puts Isaac on the other. He doesn't know how God's going to do it. He doesn't know if Isaac's going to be resurrected. He doesn't know. He just knows that God is faithful to his word. God has promised that this is the son who's going to inherit, and therefore he has to come off that mountain. And of course, when Abraham raises the knife and is getting ready to, the angel stops him and says, wait! And God provides a ram in the thicket. They sacrifice it, and then God comes and says, okay, now that I know you fear me, you'll do anything. You know that I keep my word. And as a result of Abraham's faithfulness, God says, I swear by myself, everything I have promised you, I will do. And this is the point at which Abraham's promises become locked in. Okay? One of those promises, and this is going to become important for Paul, is that God would bless all the nations, or subsequently all the Gentiles. Okay? And so Abraham, through his faithfulness, secures a blessing for all the Gentiles. And this is why James says that Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Well, he believes the promise that he's going to have an heir who's going to multiply, and the descendants are ultimately going to become as many as the stars. It's his faith in that word, his trust in that word, that enables Abraham to offer up Isaac. Okay, that's the action that comes out of his faith. And that's why James says that his works and his faith are working together. His faith finds expression in his offering of Isaac. James then goes on and talks about Rahab. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. Now, Rahab's story appears in Joshua 2. This is where she hides the spies who've come in to spy out Jericho at the beginning of Israel's conquest of the Promised Land. She hides the spies when the officials come looking for them, and she sends them out. So, oh, they just left. You can still catch them if you hurry. So they go chasing after them. Once they've left, then she lets them down through a window and tells them where to go hide, and they do until the officials come back, and then they go on and report to Joshua. But before they leave, she secures a promise for them. And the people of Jericho have heard how God has been with the Israelites, and they're afraid. They know, she says, I know and we know that God has given us into your hands. And she says in Joshua 2:12-13, Now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me by the Lord that you in turn will deal kindly with my family. Give me a sign of good faith that you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the spies promise. They say basically, okay, when we come, get everybody in this room. If they're not in your house, then we're absolved from having to fulfill that promise. And then tie a scarlet cord on the window. And that will be the sign that this is the room that we are not to demolish. And the people in there are sacred. And so she does, and they get her out of Jericho when they attack, and her family survives. And so we see again that faith, her faith, and the actions she takes have benefit not only for herself, but enables her to secure a blessing for her wider family. Okay, just like Abraham's faith enabled him to secure a blessing for all the nations, for the whole world, essentially. And just like at the very beginning, he says that your faith, if all you do is tell your brother or sister, yes, be well, and go on while they're hungry and naked, and you don't clothe them and you don't feed them, if you're not benefiting them, then your faith is of no use. And so we see here that faith and justification by faith is ultimately about securing not only your own salvation and your own blessing, but about being able to bless others. Now, this last phrase, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. I want to say a little bit about that. The image that he uses here is you have a body, and then you have a spirit that is in the body and enlivens it and makes it come alive. And once the spirit is gone, then you just have a corpse. I think we often interpret the analogy like this. Well, just as we have a body that has a spirit, so we have works, and those works have to be infused with faith in order to be of value. Okay? And that makes sense because, works are what you do with your physical body, and faith is kind of the spiritual side, which corresponds to spirit. The problem is that's not actually the analogy that James uses. No, what he says is that the body corresponds to faith, and it's the works that correspond to the Spirit. In other words, works are what enliven your faith. If your faith has no works, it's dead, just like a corpse, and it's of no use to anyone. So it's by coming to express our faith that our faith continues to grow and become more and more alive, more and more vibrant. Okay? If you want to see your faith grow, put it into action. And if you put it into action, then your faith will grow, which enables you to put it into even greater action. There's a reason God doesn't tell Abraham to go sacrifice his son Isaac back in Genesis 15. Okay, he builds up his trust and Abraham's ability to see God's faithfulness over time, so that by the time he gets to Genesis 22, he can tell him to do this, and Abraham knows, okay, I don't really understand this, but I know God's going to come through. That's how our faith grows, by finding expression. It grows through being put into works. And if it's not growing, then it's dying. As it dies, it just becomes a theology, a list of doctrines that you believe, but that have no real effect on your life. So, key points from this passage. 1, having the right theology is important, but it's not sufficient. When you get up to heaven, God's not going to give you a systematic theology exam and see what your score is, and that determines your place. Your theology is important, but it's to impact your actions and the way you live your life. Those things need to be coming together. Similarly, faith has to find expression or it will die. And then the third thing that we saw, justification is not just about you. It's what enables you to bless others. Okay, both in the exercise of your faith and in the securing of justification. So, questions to think about this week before we come together on Sunday. 1, how does your faith find expression? Think about your day. Think about your week. What are the ways that your faith impacts what you do? Is your faith growing or is it dying? Is it vibrant and alive or is it largely static and dead? 2, how does your faith benefit other people? Because if we've seen, if your faith isn't benefiting other people, then you're really not using it the right way. Think about your family. In Rahab's case, think about your business. You know, how does your faith shape what you do in such a way that it benefits more than just yourself? Okay? And then the third thing to think about, what steps could you take to grow your faith more? Again, the way to keep your faith from dying and shrinking is to put it into action. And so think about, what are some ways that I could begin to act on my faith in addition to what you're already doing that would cause it to grow even more and become even more alive? Remember, the more you put your faith into action, the more alive and real your faith will become. One final point, and I will end with this. Martin Luther, not a big fan of James. He claimed that James was a right straw epistle. This is because of James 2:24 and 26. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. Martin Luther's big insight, of course, was that we are justified by faith. This was based on Paul, not James. And so when James comes along and says, no, we're justified by works and not by faith alone, Luther did not really care for that. Just to contrast, Paul in Romans 4:5 cites the same verse from Genesis. Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But then he explains the significance, not as, Abraham's faith was working together with his works to produce justification. But for Paul, he says, but to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. In other words, faith alone, not faith and works. So this then raises a critical question. Do James and Paul, and particularly he's talking about Abraham and justification in Romans 4 and Galatians 3:6-14, so I would recommend you read through those. Do James and Paul disagree about the relationship between faith and works? Are they at loggerheads, forever butting heads, or are their different positions actually more compatible? Is there a way of holding them together? We'll talk about this on Sunday in class. As you think about it, though, think about this. 3 things. 1, how is each author, James and Paul, using the word works? What do they mean by works? What are the examples that they give of works? Okay. 2, what do they mean by faith? How are they defining faith? Faith has a pretty broad semantic range, everything from kind of doctrinal belief to trust. So how is each one of them kind of defining faith? And then the other thing to think about is, what is the context into which each of them are writing? What are they trying to address? What's the problem going on that they need to speak to? Okay, and could that somehow account for the differences in their various arguments? Okay? All right, well, have a good week as you ponder James, and I will see you on Sunday.